It was during my sister's birthday dinner, right as the wine hit my glass, that she reminded everyone my college fund never existed, unlike hers. Name's Isaac Lowell, 48 internal auditor, clutching my father's smooth pocket watch under the glow of harsh chandelier light. Ever been blindsided by family like that? It started with Evelyn's laugh, that smooth, rehearsed kind of laugh that makes the silverware stop clinking for half a beat. She leaned back in her chair, crystal glass in hand, the deep red of her Cabernet catching the chandelier light as she repeated for the third time that evening how lucky she was that Mom and Dad had paid for every last cent of her college tuition. "Full ride to Michigan State, courtesy of our folks," she said, tilting her glass toward me like she was making a toast to my absence. Of course, Isaac had to figure life out on his own. He was always so independent. Her voice sliced the room thinner than the carving knife resting beside the pork roast. The smell of roasted pork and charred carrots lingered thick in the air, mingling with the faint hum of jazz slipping from a Bluetooth speaker perched on the sideboard. The music was smooth, impersonal, like something a dentist would put on to soothe nerves. My thumb circled the worn ridges of my father's pocket watch beneath the tablecloth, feeling each tiny dent in its brass casing. It ticked faintly, a steady rhythm under my fingertips, the one thing he left me when he passed. It was my tether in a room that felt more like a board meeting than a family dinner. The dining room was a museum to Evelyn's curated perfection. Along the walls, framed photos captured her milestones: college graduation, her first consulting award, a smiling ribbon cutting with some senator whose name I couldn't remember. There wasn't a single picture of me, not from when I patched roofs at 17 to help Dad keep the lights on, not from the years I spent grinding through night classes after pulling double shifts. The omission wasn't an oversight. It was a message as clear as the polished silver Evelyn had insisted we use for the occasion. Gregory, her husband, sat at the far end, the self-appointed head of the table. He carved his pork with deliberate theatrical precision, a cold grin twitching whenever Evelyn spoke. His eyes scanned the room like he was taking inventory landing on me, only when there was a chance to measure how small I could be made to feel. "You should be grateful you've still got that auditing gig,
Isaac,"
he said, as he speared a piece of carrot.
"Not many folks your age can still hang on. Guess all those long nights with spreadsheets are good for something, huh?"
His tone was syrup over glass shards sweet, but cutting all the same. Mom and Dad didn't even glance up from their decaf. They murmured soft, pleasant platitudes about how we all have different paths, their words floating like smoke that dissipated before it could settle anywhere. I'd heard it all before, and by now their neutrality stung more than outright criticism. Across the table, Jake sat with his shoulders squared, jaw tight, his fork scraping softly against his plate, but his eyes fixed on Gregory like he could pin him to the chair if he stared hard enough. "My son has my quiet temper, but tonight he wore it like armor." Evelyn reached across me for the butter dish, the diamond on her ring catching another shard of chandelier light. "You know not everyone's cut out for college. Some of us just make things happen while others take the scenic route." "But hey, you turned out okay. Right, Isaac?" Her tone dripped with that hollow, pitying warmth she's perfected over decades. It wasn't what she said. It was how her eyes skipped past mine the moment she finished, as if I wasn't worth the confirmation. I took a sip of water I didn't want swallowing the metallic taste that always comes with holding back words. I'd learned a long time ago that fighting Evelyn's brand of condescension was like arguing with fog. You just end up wet and colder than before. Instead, I let my fingers tighten around the pocket watch, feeling the faint pulse of its ticking against my skin. Each tick felt louder than the music, louder than the scrape of utensils. It reminded me that I wasn't here to win a battle of words. Sometimes quiet is sharper than any retort. Gregory leaned back in his chair, letting his fork clatter lightly against his plate, and looked straight at me. His smirk deepened, the kind that pulls just one corner of his mouth upward, like he's in on some private joke. Some people, he said, his voice slow and deliberate, just drain the family name instead of adding to it. The jazz didn't pause, but the room did. Even Evelyn's glass hovered midair, her smile flickering for just a second before she tilted her wine again and sipped. My knuckles whitened around the watch, the brass warming under my grip. I wanted to tell him about the nights I stayed up reconciling payroll errors while he vacationed in Naples, about how I'd plugged holes in Havenbrook's balance sheets that would have sunk them if I hadn't intervened quietly without applause. But I didn't. I just let the moment stretch a thin, unbroken thread of silence until I finally pushed back my chair. The scrape of its legs against the hardwood was the loudest sound the room had heard all night. "I should get going," I said, sliding the pocket watch into my jacket pocket. My voice was even, almost polite, like I was excusing myself from a boring meeting rather than walking away from another small cut in a long series of them. Jake looked up, his brows knitting, but he didn't stop me. Evelyn gave a small shrug, the kind that said she'd already moved on in her mind. Gregory just smiled that same cold grin and cut another piece of pork like nothing had shifted. The night air outside smelled faintly of wet leaves and chimney smoke, the kind of autumn scent that usually settles me. Not tonight. As I drove down their long, manicured driveway, the pocket watch's ticking filled the car louder than the soft static of the radio, louder than the thoughts clattering around in my head. Each tick felt like it was counting something down, though I couldn't yet tell if it was toward an end or a beginning. All I knew was that I didn't feel small anymore, not angry either, just awake. Like the ticking knew something I didn't, and I was finally starting to listen. The office was dead quiet, except for the steady hum of the old printer in the corner, spitting out forms no one would bother to collect until morning. Most of the building had long since gone dark, cubicles swallowed in shadow, but I stayed behind in the glow of flickering fluorescent bulbs that buzzed like a persistent headache. It was nearly midnight. The faint smell of cold, burnt coffee lingered from the pot I'd abandoned hours ago, and somewhere down the hall, a wall clock ticked steadily, marking the late hour in an otherwise still space. I was halfway through reconciling invoices when a flagged email caught my eye, its subject line reading simply, "Temporary Transfer Authorization. Pension Reserve." Curious, I opened it, my eyes narrowing as I scrolled. It was a request from Gregory marked urgent to move funds out of Havenbrook's pension reserves into a private investment account. Temporary, he'd claimed, though no end date was given. No collateral listed, no board approval documented. My jaw tightened as I read the bland corporate phrasing. These weren't just numbers. These were retirements, paychecks, the fragile promises the company made to people who had given it decades. Promises Gregory was treating like his personal ATM. I printed the email chain, the whir of the printer unusually loud in the empty office. Each page fed out slow, deliberate, like it knew the weight of what it carried. I slid the printouts into a plain manila folder and almost unconsciously marked the tab with my initials in pencil IL, just the way my father used to label his ledgers when he still handled Havenbrook's early accounts. It felt like muscle memory more than thought, the kind of habit you don't realize is inherited until it surfaces in moments like these. The room felt colder as I sat back the glow from my monitor, casting pale light across rows of untouched cubicles. A coworker, one of the few who trusted me enough to whisper, had left a sticky note on my desk before leaving earlier that night. The scrawl was hurried, but legible. Audit this before they bury it. The note was pressed beside a cooling cup of coffee, a silent warning, and an invitation all at once. I crumpled the note, not to discard it, but to keep it in my pocket, a reminder that not everyone had turned a blind eye. I opened the financial statements and started cross-referencing line items, the rhythmic tap of my pen filling the silence as I traced every inconsistency. Discrepancies lined up like breadcrumbs, delayed payments, unexplained transfers, sub-ledger adjustments, marked with vague codes that meant nothing on paper but screamed of cover-ups to anyone who had been doing this as long as I had. My frustration stayed quiet, simmering beneath a practiced calm. If I'd learned anything in 48 years, it's that shouting doesn't fix things. Numbers do. After an hour, I reached for my phone and dialed Calvin. The line clicked twice before his familiar voice came through smooth and deliberate, like the slow turn of an old key. "It's late, Isaac. This can't be social." "It's not," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I think Gregory's moving pension money off the books. I've got printouts, dates, the works." A soft sigh came from the other end. Not surprise so much as confirmation. "Then, you need to do 2 things," he said. "First, don't breathe a word of this to anyone but me. Second, check your father's shareholder files. The old Class B shares." I frowned, glancing at the dusty cabinet behind my desk, where I'd kept Dad's things after he passed. "Those are still valid." "They might be," Calvin replied. "Those shares came with a clause, a nasty little oversight that lets you force a forensic audit if fraud is suspected. It was written back when your father and I fought off that hostile takeover in '92. No one's bothered to revoke it because, frankly, no one remembered it existed." His voice dropped, slightly almost conspiratorial. "If that clause still stands, Gregory won't see you coming. It's quiet power, Isaac, your kind of weapon." The words sat heavy in the air as I stood and crossed to the cabinet. My fingers brushed over a layer of dust before I pulled open the bottom drawer, revealing a box so weathered the cardboard edges were frayed like old fabric. Inside were my father's ledgers, their leather covers worn smooth by his hands. I lifted one and felt its weight heavier than paper had any right to be heavier because of what it represented. It wasn't just a record. It was proof that the old rules still had teeth if I was willing to wield them. I carried the box to my desk and set it beside the folder of printouts, the contrast striking. My father's careful handwriting in pencil beside Gregory's polished, sanitized emails, each page humming with its own kind of tension. I thought about Dad, how he used to tell me that patience wins more battles than anger ever could. My hands stilled on the desk, fingers grazing the edge of the pocket watch lying beside my keyboard. It ticked faintly softer than it had at dinner a few years back, as if it were tiring, waiting for me to decide whether I'd actually act or let it wind down. Calvin's voice cut back in, steady as ever. "You still there, Isaac?" "Yeah," I said, eyes fixed on the watch. "I'm here." "Good. Take your time. Do it right. And don't tell Gregory a thing until it's too late for him to react." The line went dead, leaving only the low hum of the heater and the faint tick of the wall clock in the hall. I shut down my laptop, the blue glow fading, and sat in the dim light for a moment longer. The office felt hollow now, the kind of quiet that presses in on your ears. I stared at the pocket watch on my desk, its ticking weaker, almost irregular, like it was warning me that time doesn't wait for hesitation. I slipped it into my coat pocket, grabbed the box of ledgers, and headed for the exit. The fluorescent bulbs flickered once as I passed, casting a brief shadow on the wall that felt larger than I was. Out in the freezing parking lot, my breath fogged the air as I loaded the box into my car. The ticking of the watch was muffled now, buried beneath my coat, but each faint beat was clear enough to count, reminding me that I was holding on to more than just brass and gears. Something had shifted tonight. The numbers weren't just numbers anymore. They were leverage, and I finally knew where to press. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried eggs, a place that reminded me of late nights with Dad when I was 16. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth, fingers around a chipped mug, the faint ticking of his old pocket watch steady in my coat. Across from me, Calvin slid a manila envelope across the greasy table.
"The clause is still binding,"
he said quietly. "Your father's Class B shares let you trigger a forensic audit and remove anyone proven guilty of fraud." I flipped through the yellowed documents, hearing only the hiss of the griddle and soft country music overhead. The weight of Dad's legacy sat heavier than the papers themselves. Calvin circled the key lines and pushed a pen my way. My hand trembled as I signed the declaration, the pen scratching against the sticky table. Before I could exhale, my phone buzzed. A text from Jake. "Greg bragged you'll be out by summer. Watch your back, Dad." I pocketed the phone, the envelope, and felt the watch ticking harder as I stepped out into the cold night, the neon open sign flickering like a warning. Gregory's voice came smooth at first, the kind of practiced calm that made people forget there was a knife hidden in the tone. "Close the door, Isaac," he said, standing by his mahogany desk, the glass walls of his corner office, framing the late summer sun like a spotlight. I stepped inside, the faint whir of the HVAC humming behind the drawn blinds as he tugged them shut. The metallic scent of polished steel and wood polish clung to the air, sterile and cold. My hand brushed the pocket of my coat, feeling the cool weight of my father's watch pressing against my palm, my only anchor, as Gregory turned toward me. "You need to stop sniffing around the pension files," he said, voice steady, but his jaw tight. The veneer of control was cracking just enough to show a flicker of panic beneath the arrogance. He leaned forward, palms flat on the desk, his reflection rippling in the polished wood. "This obsession of yours isn't helping anyone. You're making yourself look desperate." I stayed silent. Years in auditing taught me that quiet unsettles men like Gregory more than argument ever could. My eyes drifted to the tall windows where the sunlight cut hard lines across the floor, each stripe like a bar in a cage. The hum of the HVAC filled the pauses. He didn't know how to sit through a low drone that made every word feel heavier. Gregory circled the desk, his leather shoes barely making a sound on the tile, and came to stand a foot from me. His smile was sharp, but his eyes darted, calculating, cornered. "You think you're clever digging through numbers, pulling strings your father left behind. But this is my company now, my family's legacy. You're clinging to ghosts, Isaac." I felt the watch through the fabric of my coat, the cold brass steady beneath my fingers. My father's ghost, maybe. His lesson, definitely patience, precision, not rage. I didn't respond, and my silence must have struck a nerve. Gregory's hand shot out, snatching at the bulge in my pocket. The sudden motion was more frantic than confident. He yanked the watch free, holding it up to the light, as though inspecting an artifact he meant to discard.
"So, this is it,"
he scoffed, fingers curling around the timepiece. "A dead man's trinket." Without warning, he dropped it to the tile. The crack was sharp, the sound slicing through the hum of the HVAC. The glass face shattered, gears stalling mid-tick. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint echo of the impact and the whisper of air conditioning pushing through the vents. I crouched instinctively, fingertips brushing over the shards. The brass was cold, the glass biting into my skin as I picked up the pieces. A thin line of blood welled along my palm, where a shard nicked me, a stinging reminder of how easily something treasured could be broken. Gregory crouched just enough to sneer down at me.
You're nothing without this family or this company.
He said each word deliberate, almost savoring the weight of it. I stood slowly cradling the broken watch in my hand, the blood smearing faintly against the brass. I met his eyes for the first time and said nothing. The silence stretched between us, brittle as the cracked glass in my palm, until I turned and walked out. My shoes clicked softly against the tile, the sound steady controlled as his presence faded behind me. The late summer air outside hit sharp against my face, a gust carrying the dry scent of asphalt and cut grass from the grounds. Jake was already waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his old sedan with his arms crossed. When he saw the watch, he straightened his brows, knitting, as he took it from my hand, carefully, like it might fall apart further if he breathed wrong. The blood along my palm had begun to bead dark against my skin. He didn't ask what happened. He just closed his fingers around the broken pieces and said low enough for only me to hear, "Do this right, Dad. Not for them, for you." His voice was steady, not pleading, not commanding, just anchoring me in a way only he could. I flexed my hand, feeling the sting where the shard had bitten deep. Each pulse of pain felt like a reminder that something had shifted, that I wasn't coming back into this building as the same man. The ticking from the watch was gone, the silence heavy in my coat pocket as Jake and I walked to the car. The glass facade of the office tower reflected the sinking sun, casting long shadows across the parking lot as we pulled away. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped under its shine. The watch might be silent, but I knew what its silence meant. It wasn't time to grieve. It was time to move. It was 1:14 a.m., my house dark except for the dim glow of my desk lamp. Papers covered the table, the air stale with cold coffee. My father's cracked pocket watch lay beside me, silent, since Gregory smashed it, its fractured glass catching the light. On my screen, the shareholders' agenda scrolled by my name listed quietly under advisory proxy. Gregory hadn't noticed. That single line felt like a door left ajar. I stacked the pension fraud emails, financial anomalies, and the clause from Dad's old Class B shares into a single neat packet. Calvin, calm on a video call, nodded. "It's clean. Send it. Say nothing." Jake paused at the door.
You really want to do this?
I only nodded. The house was silent as I typed. For compliance, agenda review, and hit send. The wall clock ticked louder than before. The pocket watch twitched its second hand, jerking forward once before stilling. My screen chimed with a new email, Resolution 9B, added to agenda. Please attend as advisory shareholder. I closed the lamp holding the cold watch. Its time would come soon. The boardroom felt colder than it looked. The polished oak table gleamed under the recessed lights, but the still air carried a tautness that made every shuffle of paper and pen tap echo like a crack in glass. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Maumee River moved in slow ribbons of silver beneath a pale spring sky. I sat midway down the table, back straight hands, folded the weight of my father's pocket watch pressing against the inside of my jacket. The gears inside were stiff, its tick barely audible, but the faint pulse kept my focus steady. Gregory stood at the far end, flanked by Evelyn, a glass of water trembling faintly in her manicured hand, as she tried to appear composed. He radiated confidence voice, rich with charm, as he projected slides onto the wall charts climbing upward, buzzwords flowing as easily as the catered coffee into his porcelain cup.
Havenbrook is thriving,
he said, his smile catching the light. These pension reallocations are strategic maneuvers for growth, not risks. Trust the process. His voice filled the room, but his words landed hollow, each phrase bouncing off the leather chairs without sticking. The secretary cleared her throat, her tone neutral, as she flipped to the next item. Resolution 9B, proposed system-wide compliance audit inclusive of pension funds and executive performance review, advisory proxy submission. She didn't glance at me, didn't need to. The phrasing was dry, procedural, just as Calvin and I had intended. No hints of blood, no scent of conflict, just housekeeping in legal clothing. Gregory's brow twitched for a moment, then smoothed as he leaned against his chair, confident enough to wave a dismissive hand.
Another audit, fine. If it reassures the room, let's keep the trains on time.
The board murmured softly. Nods exchanged pens, poised. The vote went up. Hands, subtle nods. A few abstentions. No drama, no drawn-out debate. The secretary's voice broke the silence like a scalpel. Motion passes. 52% in favor. Gregory chuckled under his breath, already shifting to wrap up the meeting. He gathered his notes, slid his cufflinks into place, and walked toward the boardroom doors. I rose quietly, the pocket watch's faint ticking, syncing with my breath. Calvin caught my eye from across the table, his expression unreadable, but the slightest nod passed between us like a shared signal. Gregory pressed his access card to the reader. A soft beep, then a red light. He frowned and tried again. Another beep, another red flash. This time, the screen above the reader flickered with words in sterile font. Access revoked. Per, Resolution 9B. The chatter in the room died instantly. Chairs creaked as heads turned, whispers, rising like wind through dry leaves. Evelyn's water glass clinked against the table as her hand trembled, her composure cracking for the first time. Gregory's face paled, the polished veneer draining as he stared at the display.
"What the hell?"
he muttered, pressing the card again harder, as if force could override the system. The red light blinked back at him, unyielding. He spun toward me, voice low but laced with disbelief.
"What did you just do?"
I reached into my jacket, pulled out the pocket watch, and held it up just enough for him to see. The cracked glass caught the overhead light, and beneath it, the second hand ticked slow, deliberate, alive again. I didn't answer him. Instead, I slipped the watch back into my jacket and walked past the faint ticking trailing with me as I pushed open the door he no longer could. Behind me, the room buzzed with low voices, the kind of hushed awe that follows an earthquake when everyone realizes the ground just shifted beneath their feet. The morning light streamed through the half-open blinds, soft stripes of gold stretching across the fresh paint of my new office. The smell of brewing coffee drifted from a small machine in the corner, warm and grounding, carrying with it a sense of something starting rather than ending. On the far wall, the pocket watch hung in a simple frame, its glass face gleaming, pristine. Again gears turning steadily. Its quiet, even ticking filled the room, each sound a small affirmation. For the first time since it shattered, it felt whole, and so did I. Calvin leaned against the doorway, his coat still draped over his shoulders, despite the mild summer warmth. His expression was calm, almost wistful, as he looked from the watch to me. "Your father would have liked this outcome," he said, voice low, as though we were in a church. "Not for the win for the legacy." His words lingered in the space between us, the only sound breaking them, the muted hum of a ceiling fan overhead. I paused mid-signature, letting his sentiment settle before I nodded quietly. pressing my pen back to the stack of documents before me. The Lowell Foundation had existed for only a few weeks, but the desks now occupied by 2 former Havenbrook employees, both quietly tapping at keyboards, made it feel real. Their presence was unspoken proof that some good could still be salvaged from the wreckage Gregory left behind. My pen moved deliberately as I filled out the last of the grant disbursements for the month, the ticking of the watch punctuating each line I signed. Each pen stroke carried a kind of weight, not the heaviness of battle, but the solidity of building something that might last. Jake slipped into the office, his arm straining around a cardboard box of supplies. He set it gently on the corner table, dusting his hands off as he looked around. His eyes lingered on the watch, then drifted to the framed black and white photo of Dad opposite it. There was a faint smile on his lips as he met my gaze. "Feels better than just getting even, huh?" He said, his voice light, but knowing. I chuckled under my breath, not because it was funny, but because he was right. Revenge had been the fuel, but these walls, this ticking, these paychecks going out to people who deserved them, this was the point. "Yeah," I said, sliding another signed check to the growing pile. "It does." Calvin stepped forward, placing a fresh envelope on my desk. Inside were the final incorporation papers, the last step before the foundation would stand fully on its own. His faint smile deepened as he gestured toward the document. "Sign it, and this isn't just a gesture anymore. It's permanent." I uncapped my pen and placed the tip to the paper. The ticking of the watch, steady and deliberate, echoed faintly against the walls, each tick aligning with the flow of ink as I wrote my name. When the last stroke of my signature landed, I set the pen down, slowly savoring the stillness that followed. For a moment, none of us spoke. The 2 employees kept working quietly, their typing blending into the soft rhythm of the room. Jake leaned against the edge of the desk, Calvin standing tall near the doorway, both watching in their own ways as I rose and crossed to the window. Downtown Toledo moved below a slow parade of morning commuters, weaving along sunlit streets, their motions ordinary, yet reassuring. I rested my hand against the window frame, feeling the faint vibration of traffic far beneath my palm. The watch's ticking continued behind me, steady and sure, like it finally trusted me to keep time with it, rather than against it. My breath fogged the glass faintly as I whispered just loud enough for myself. "We're not done building yet." The words left my mouth like a quiet promise carried by the hum of the city outside. The morning light shifted, brightening the room another shade as I turned back to the desk. The signed documents sat neatly stacked. The watch ticked on, and for the first time in years, the silence in the room felt alive rather than empty. The hum of quiet conversation filled the hall, a warm, steady current that blended with the faint scent of brewed coffee and powdered sugar from trays of donuts stacked along the tables. The folding chairs creaked as people settled in, not executives or board members this time, but line workers, retirees, their families' faces lined by years of loyalty that had nearly been discarded when Gregory's schemes came to light. The overhead lights glowed soft and steady, casting a golden sheen across the bright renovated community center. For the first time in years, the energy in the room felt like something being built, rather than torn apart. By the reception desk, a modest plaque read, "Lowell Foundation, no one left behind." Beside it, a black and white photo of Dad holding the same pocket watch, now sitting on a side table, stood in a simple frame. The gears inside that watch ticked steadily, faint but certain audible only when the room quieted for a breath. I caught the sound between handshakes, each rhythmic beat like an invisible metronome, guiding the moment forward. I stood near the podium. The microphone adjusted low, my notes in hand, though I hardly needed them. The faces in the crowd weren't here for speeches. They were here for something tangible, something that reassured them that the Foundation's promises weren't just ink on a page. Jake moved between tables with a clipboard, his posture relaxed, but his eyes bright, making sure everyone who came left with what they needed, be it information or reassurance. Calvin leaned quietly against the back wall, arms crossed, his gaze soft but intent, the faintest smile tugging at the edge of his mouth as he watched. When the room settled, I cleared my throat and let my voice carry just enough to reach the back row. We all know what it felt like to almost lose everything I said, my tone even but steady, and we all know it wasn't right. But today isn't about looking back. Today is about making sure that no one in this room or their families ever has to feel that way again. The murmurs eased into stillness, a quiet affirmation in their silence rather than applause. I gestured to the first scholarship envelope on the table beside me, sliding it into the hands of a young woman whose father had worked Havenbrook's floors for 3 decades. Her fingers tightened around it as tears welled not from the money itself, but from what it represented, a sign that loyalty hadn't been forgotten even after the chaos. The watch's ticking punctuated the moment softly, a steady counterpoint to the shifting weight of gratitude in the room. One by one, envelopes and handshakes passed between me and the crowd. Each exchange felt like a small stitch mending something that had been torn long before Gregory's exit. The work wasn't glamorous and it wasn't fast, but it was solid. As the line thinned, an elderly man with sun-creased skin and a slight tremor in his hand approached. He gripped my palm with surprising strength, leaning close so only I could hear. "You saved our pensions. And more," he whispered. His words carried no embellishment, no ceremony, but they landed heavier than any formal recognition. I nodded once, my throat tight, the smell of coffee grounding me in the moment. The sun had begun to dip by the time the last few chairs emptied, streaks of orange and soft pink filtering through the high windows, washing the hall in a gentle glow. I turned toward the side table where the pocket watch sat its ticking steady against the hush that followed the crowd's departure. The glass face caught the fading light, a quiet reminder of everything that had fractured and been put back together. I stepped to the window, the city beyond, slowing under the weight of dusk. The air carried the faint hum of traffic and the distant sound of a train rolling somewhere out of sight. My reflection in the glass was faint, half blurred by the light behind me. Looking out at the horizon, I murmured to myself, "This is what lasting feels like." The words didn't need to reach anyone else. They were just for me, for Dad, for the ticking watch, and the quiet promise that what we'd built here would keep moving long after the sun slipped below the edge of Toledo. Behind me, the Lowell Foundation's plaque glinted under the soft lights, and the watch ticked on, steady and unhurried, keeping time for something greater than vengeance. The sun was sinking low outside the community center, streaking the windows with soft amber as the repaired pocket watch ticked gently on the table beside me. Its steady rhythm felt less like a countdown now, and more like a quiet reminder that time once broken can be pieced back together. Justice had its place, but what stayed with me wasn't the victory. It was the chance to turn wreckage into something worth passing on. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones deserve rebuilding. For anyone facing layoffs, heartbreak, or a sudden ending, know that a new foundation can still rise from it. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?